What if the most ruthless man in Westeros was never supposed to rule at all? What if everything Tywin Lannister became was born from a single moment of humiliation so devastating that it rewired his entire existence? Most people think they know Tywin's story. They're wrong. Picture this. A teenage boy walking into his ancestral home to find grown men laughing at his father's face. Not behind closed doors, not in whispered conversations. Right there in the great hall of Casterly Rock, vassals openly mocking the Lord of the Westerlands while he just took it. That boy was Tywin Lannister, and what happened next didn't just change him. It changed the fate of 7 kingdoms. Here's what nobody tells you about power in Westeros. It's not about gold, though the Lannisters had more than anyone. It's not about armies, though they commanded the largest. It's about understanding one simple truth that separates kings from corpses. Fear lasts longer than love, and respect built on terror never fades. But Tywin didn't start with terror. He started with shame so deep it carved itself into his soul and created something the world had never seen before. A man who would spend 30 years orchestrating the most elaborate revenge in the history of the 7 kingdoms. A revenge so perfect that by the time his enemies realized what was happening, their children were already bowing to Lannister grandchildren on the Iron Throne. You think Robert's rebellion was about honor? You think the War of the 5 Kings was about succession? You're looking at shadows on the wall while the real puppet master pulled strings you never even noticed. Every major event in Westeros for 3 decades was just another move in a game so complex that even the players didn't understand the rules. The scary part, it almost didn't work. There was one moment, one decision, one betrayal so perfectly timed that it flipped the entire realm upside down. Miss that moment by even a day, and the Targaryens would still rule while the Lannisters rotted in obscurity. But Tywin Lannister doesn't miss. He calculates, he waits. And when the perfect moment arrives, he strikes with a precision that makes gods jealous. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the Game of Thrones. This isn't just the story of how one man climbed from humiliation to ultimate power. This is the blueprint for how patience, brutality, and surgical precision can reshape an entire world. This is Tywin Lannister's Masterplan, and once you see it, you'll never watch Game of Thrones the same way again. The rise from ashes. What if everything you thought you knew about Tywin Lannister was wrong? What if the most feared man in Westeros wasn't born powerful, but instead crawled from complete humiliation to become the puppet master of the 7 kingdoms? Today, we're diving deep into the calculated genius of Tywin Lannister's decades-long master plan that transformed his family from laughingstock to royalty. Picture this. A young Tywin returning to Casterly Rock to find his family's bannermen openly mocking his father to his face, visitors laughing in their halls, vassals refusing to pay their debts, some houses even renouncing their loyalty entirely, joining the Tyrells instead. This was House Lannister under Tytos Lannister, weak, ridiculed, and bleeding gold without getting respect in return. But Tywin saw something others missed. He understood that in Westeros, fear commands more loyalty than kindness ever could. While his father Tytos was lending vast sums of gold to bannermen who simply refused to pay it back, young Tywin was learning the harsh realities of power at King Aegon's court. He was building alliances, particularly with a young prince named Aerys Targaryen, who would later become the Mad King. When Tywin returned from the War of the Ninepenny Kings at 18, knighted and decorated with honor, he found his family's situation had only worsened. The whispers had become open laughter. The debts had grown mountainous. Houses Rain and Tarbeck, the worst offenders, weren't just refusing to pay. They were actively defying Lannister authority. This is where Tywin's true nature revealed itself. Without his father's permission, he raised an army. He summoned Houses Reyne and Tarbeck to answer for their crimes. They refused, thinking they could treat the son as they had treated the father. They were catastrophically wrong. What Tywin did next would echo through Westeros for generations. He didn't just defeat House Reyne, he erased them completely. When they retreated to their underground stronghold of Castamere, Tywin did something so brutal, so absolute, that it became the stuff of legends. He diverted a river and flooded their halls while the entire family was inside. Men, women, children, the entire bloodline drowned in their own home. The song, The Rains of Castamere, wasn't just born from this act. It became Tywin's calling card. From that moment on, he rarely needed to raise another sword. He would simply send a bard to play the song, and rebellious lords would remember what happened to the last family that defied a Lannister. House Tarbeck met a similar fate, though perhaps even more personally devastating. Tywin captured Lady Tarbeck's son and heir, then watched as she made increasingly desperate demands for his return. When she finally threatened to harm hostages of her own, Tywin's response was chilling in its simplicity. He sent her back her son's head. These weren't random acts of violence, they were calculated demonstrations. Tywin understood that reputation is a form of power, and he was building his reputation one bloody example at a time. The weak father who had allowed bannermen to laugh at him was effectively replaced by a son who would rather see you dead than disrespected. But here's what makes this truly masterful. Tywin didn't stop there. He knew that controlling the Westerlands was just the beginning. His real ambition was much larger, much more dangerous, and it required a completely different kind of strategy. When Tytos finally died, making Tywin the official Lord of Casterly Rock, he used the transition to clean house entirely. His father's mistress dismissed. Old courtiers who had grown comfortable with weakness gone. Anyone who represented the old way of doing things was systematically removed. Tywin wasn't just inheriting power, he was completely restructuring it. The genius of this first phase of Tywin's plan becomes clear when you realize what he accomplished in just a few short years. He took a house that couldn't command respect in its own lands and turned it into something that commanded fear throughout the continent. But fear alone doesn't make you the most powerful family in Westeros. For that, you need to be closer to the Iron Throne. And this is where Tywin's early friendship with Aerys Targaryen would prove to be the most important relationship of his life. Because when Aerys unexpectedly became king much earlier than anyone anticipated, after his father Aegon died at 59 and his brother Jaehaerys at just 37, he remembered his old friend from their youth. Stay with us, because what happens next reveals the true scope of Tywin's ambitions, and it's bigger than anyone realized. The Hand's hidden game. At 20 years old, Tywin Lannister became the youngest Hand of the King in Westerosi history. But this wasn't just a friend doing a favor. It was the next crucial phase of a plan that would span decades. Aerys needed someone he could trust, someone competent, someone who could actually govern while he focused on being king. Tywin needed access to the levers of real power in the Seven Kingdoms. What followed was perhaps the most successful period of Targaryen rule in generations, but here's the twist. It was really Lannister rule in everything but name. Tywin repealed the common folk-friendly reforms of Aegon V, understanding that keeping the merchant classes happy was more important for long-term stability. He gave tax breaks to those who could actually pay them, and most crucially, he used Lannister gold to guarantee the crown's debts to the Iron Bank of Braavos. This move was brilliant for multiple reasons. First, it solved an immediate crisis. The Iron Bank doesn't forget debts, and kings who can't pay them tend to find themselves facing well-funded rebellions. Second, it made the crown dependent on Lannister wealth in a way that would be almost impossible to undo. Third, it positioned Tywin as the man who saved the realm's finances, making him not just powerful, but indispensable. But even as Tywin was consolidating power and proving his worth as Hand, cracks were forming in his relationship with Aerys. And these cracks centered around the one thing that could make Tywin Lannister lose his legendary composure: his wife, Joanna. Tywin was absolutely devoted to Joanna. She was his cousin, his closest confidant, and according to everyone who knew them, the only person who could make the intimidating Lord of Casterly Rock actually smile and laugh. But Aerys wanted her too, and he was the king. At Tywin and Joanna's wedding, Aerys took what were described as unwanted liberties during the bedding ceremony. Tywin couldn't openly object. You don't challenge a king over such matters. But Queen Rhaella could and did, dismissing Joanna from her service and sending her back to Casterly Rock. This personal insult was eating away at their friendship. But Tywin was still playing the long game. When Joanna gave birth to twins, Cersei and Jaime, Tywin saw an opportunity that could solve everything. The royal succession needed strengthening, and what better way than a marriage alliance between their children? After Tytos died, and Tywin became the official Lord of Casterly Rock, he invited Aerys to visit the Westerlands. Whether this was to show off his power base or because Aerys wanted to see Joanna again, or both, we'll never know. But when they returned to King's Landing together, their relationship had deteriorated significantly. The breaking point came when Tywin made his move. At a tournament celebrating Prince Viserys' birth, he formally proposed a marriage between Prince Rhaegar and Cersei. From Tywin's perspective, this made perfect sense. Rhaegar needed a wife. There were no available Targaryen women, and Cersei was the daughter of the second most powerful house in Westeros. It should have been an easy yes. Instead, Aerys delivered one of the most devastating insults in Westerosi political history. He told Tywin that his servant's daughter was not a suitable match for the heir to the Iron Throne. Servant's daughter. After everything Tywin had done for the realm, after all the years as Hand, after saving the crown's finances with his own gold, Aerys called him a servant. The insult went deeper. When Tywin suggested that Jaime could serve as Rhaegar's squire, Aerys refused that too. He was systematically rejecting any attempt to elevate House Lannister's status through connection to the royal family. But he was also revealing something crucial. He was afraid of Tywin's growing power. From this moment on, every action Tywin took has to be viewed through this lens. Aerys had humiliated him publicly and blocked his path to true power. So what was a man like Tywin Lannister going to do about it? The defiance of Duskendale provides the perfect example of how toxic their relationship had become. When Lord Darklyn defied the crown by demanding lower taxes for his port, a reasonable request given how King's Landing's growth had damaged Duskendale's trade, Aerys wanted to handle it personally. Tywin urged restraint, but Aerys ignored his hand and rode to Duskendale, where he was promptly captured and thrown in a dungeon. Here's where it gets interesting. Tywin marched the royal army to Duskendale and demanded the king's release. When Lord Darklyn refused, claiming he'd kill the king if attacked, Tywin prepared to storm the castle anyway. He was willing to risk the king's death. Only Sir Barristan Selmy's impossible heroics, a one-man rescue mission that somehow succeeded, saved Aerys's life. But instead of being grateful, Aerys became even more suspicious. Had his hand really been willing to let him die? Did Tywin have a secret understanding with Prince Rhaegar about the succession? The paranoia was growing, and it was about to get much worse. When Tywin tried to arrange a marriage between Jaime and Lysa Tully, a move that would have secured important allies in the Riverlands, Aerys struck back in the most personal way possible. He named Jaime to the Kingsguard, making it impossible for him to inherit Casterly Rock and forcing Tywin to make Tyrion his heir instead. This was the final straw. Tywin resigned as Hand of the King and returned to Casterly Rock, where he would wait and watch as the realm descended into chaos. But his withdrawal wasn't a retreat, it was a strategic repositioning. because Tywin Lannister was about to play the most dangerous game of his life. The question is, how much of what came next was planned, and how much was opportunism? The answer will shock you. The perfect betrayal. When Robert's rebellion erupted across the Seven Kingdoms, Tywin Lannister made a choice that would define his legacy forever. He did nothing. While the realm tore itself apart, while great houses chose sides and armies marched, the most powerful lord in Westeros sat in Casterly Rock and waited. But this wasn't indecision. This was the most calculated move of his entire career. Think about what Tywin was seeing. The rebels had significant advantages. The Stormlands, the North, the Vale, and the Riverlands were all united against the Iron Throne. But they also had major problems. Dorne remained loyal to the Targaryens. The Reach commanded the largest army in Westeros. And most importantly, Prince Rhaegar, the heir everyone actually respected, had disappeared entirely, leaving his mad father to manage the war. For someone like Tywin, this uncertainty was actually an opportunity. He understood that the winning side would need allies, and allies who joined early got better terms than those who joined late. But allies who joined at exactly the right moment, after the outcome was clear, but before the victory was complete, could position themselves as kingmakers. The Battle of the Trident changed everything. When Prince Rhaegar finally emerged from whatever he'd been doing for months, he led the royal forces against Robert Baratheon personally. His death on Robert's warhammer didn't just kill the Targaryen heir, it killed any hope the loyalist forces had of victory. The Dornish army was shattered. The Reach forces were conspicuously absent, still besieging Storm's End instead of defending their king. This was the moment Tywin had been waiting for, but he needed to move fast, and he needed to move decisively. Robert Baratheon was going to win, but Robert also knew that the Lannisters had sat out almost the entire war. How do you convince the new king that you're his ally when you've spent months refusing to help him? Tywin's solution was as brilliant as it was brutal. If he could reach King's Landing first, if he could deliver the city to Robert personally, then his late entry into the war would look like strategic timing rather than cowardly hesitation. He marched his army to the capital with incredible speed, but when they arrived, they faced a problem. The city was still held by Aerys and his remaining forces. Here's where Tywin's reputation for ruthlessness became his greatest asset. Aerys, despite everything that had happened between them, still hoped that his former hand was coming to save him. The gates of King's Landing were opened for the Lannister army because everyone assumed they were there to defend the king. Instead, they sacked the city. Tywin's forces rampaged through King's Landing, but this wasn't random violence. This was targeted destruction designed to send a very specific message. The most important targets were Prince Rhaegar's wife Elia and their children. Tywin ordered his most trusted men, Sir Gregor Clegane and Sir Amory Lorch, to kill them personally. When Robert Baratheon arrived at the capital, he found the city taken, the royal family dead, and Tywin Lannister presenting their bodies as proof of his loyalty to the new regime. It was a test, and Robert passed it. Despite Ned Stark's disgust at the murdered children, Robert accepted Tywin's offering. He needed the Lannisters more than he needed moral purity. But here's the truly masterful part of Tywin's plan. He hadn't just switched sides at the perfect moment. He had positioned House Lannister as the only logical partner for the new Baratheon dynasty. Look at the political landscape after the rebellion. Dorne had fought for the Targaryens and would never forgive the new king. The Reach had played both sides and couldn't be trusted. The Iron Islands hadn't participated meaningfully. Ned Stark wanted to return to the north and avoid southern politics. That left the Lannisters as the only great house with the wealth, power, and reliability that Robert needed to govern effectively. And Tywin sealed the deal with the perfect marriage proposal. His daughter Cersei for the new king. Robert needed a queen, And Cersei was the most eligible daughter of a major house. It wasn't just politically smart, it was practically inevitable. But Tywin's master plan went even deeper than a royal marriage. Once Cersei was queen, he systematically filled King's Landing with Lannister loyalists. Grand Maester Pycelle was already in place and completely devoted to House Lannister. The Kingsguard needed new members after the rebellion, so Boros Blount and Meryn Trant, both Lannister supporters, were appointed alongside Jaime. Lancel and Tyrek Lannister became the king's squires. Ilyn Payne, a Lannister bannerman, was made the king's justice. By the time Ned Stark arrived in King's Landing as Hand of the King, everyone understood who really held power. The Baratheons might wear the crown, but the Lannisters controlled everything else. And Tywin didn't even need to be there personally. He could run the Seven Kingdoms from Casterly Rock through his network of loyalists and his daughter's influence over the king. This was the completion of Tywin's decades-long master plan. He had taken a house that couldn't command respect in its own lands and made it the power behind the Iron Throne. His grandchildren would be kings and queens. The Lannister name would be remembered forever. And he had done it all through a combination of patience, brutality, and perfect timing. When the War of the Five Kings began, it wasn't really about five kings. It was about whether Tywin Lannister's master plan would survive its greatest test. Because everything he had built over 30 years was about to be challenged by enemies who understood exactly how dangerous he was. The legacy of Tywin's master plan would shape Westeros for generations, proving that in the Game of Thrones, the most dangerous player isn't always the one wearing the crown. It's the one smart enough to put someone else on the throne and keep them there. From laughingstock to kingmaker, from weakness to ultimate power, this was Tywin Lannister's master plan, and it changed everything.